UFC 299 O'Malley versus Vera 2 is going on this weekend at the Kaseya Center in Miami, Florida, and there's so much you could talk about on this card since it's stacked from top to bottom. I definitely want to make some scripted content for this card, but I took so long to write scripted content for 298 that it passed by the time I was finished. So I just kind of wanted to record something off the top of my head for this card. And I don't think there will be much issue because, like I said, it is so stacked. And I just kind of want to have something to organize the video around. And the concept I want to talk about today with regards to 299 is a concept I think the main card demonstrates in every matchup on it. And that's the topic of momentum. So you can talk about momentum a lot in fight sports. And it's a really important thing because you have a lot of tangible aspects that you can break down when you're looking at a fight. You could look at the fighter's records. You could look at the actual skills that a fighter has in the cage. How long have they been wrestling? What martial arts have they trained in? Have they gotten any certain credentials in these martial arts that they're bringing in there with them? All of those things matter. But there are other things that go into those matchups too, and one of those big intangibles that can have a huge role in fights is the topic of momentum. So when you're talking about momentum in fight sports, take a look at Tony Ferguson, for example. In May of 2012, he would lose to Michael Johnson, and then after that, it would take him 8 years before he would lose again in May of 2020 to Justin Gaethje. I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with that stretch of Tony's career, that 12-fight win streak. And that's the stuff of legends. People were thinking that you would have to be from Russia wrestling bears from the time that you were a child in order to take down Tony Ferguson at that point in time. But then he ran into the train that is Justin Gaethje, got put on his highlight reel, and suddenly we are where we are now. At the peak of his powers, would you have ever picked Paddy Pimblett to beat Tony Ferguson? No, and you would have been an idiot if you had decided to do that. But what you can even see furthermore from that is that obviously he's doing way worse at the end of his career, right? What does momentum have to do with that? He's just old. He's just fallen off, right? But I think that a lot of it comes down to that confidence too, because at the start of that loss streak, right after he fought Justin Gaethje, Tony Ferguson fought Charles Oliveira, one of the deadliest finishers, not only in the lightweight division, but in the UFC, not right now, but in history. He's the most decorated finisher we've ever seen, and that includes his submission game on the ground. He got caught in this just disgusting armbar by Charles Oliveira. If you haven't seen it, you need to go look it up and see it, because that thing is filthy. And he somehow doesn't tap to it. Whereas he also ends up getting caught in a choke that he is unable to escape from or withstand by Bobby Green towards the end of his streak. Now, I'm not trying to disrespect Bobby Green in any capacity. He's a fantastic fighter, and so are many of the people that Tony has lost to on a streak. Paddy's even a good fighter. He gets overrated by some, underrated by others, but regardless, you get the point, and Paddy wasn't able to get through Tony. But being able to survive the submission game of Charles Oliveira, but ending up getting submitted to Bobby Green, shows you how much of a decline he did have, and just how much momentum shifted against him. Now, momentum is not a foolproof, die-hard concept. Take again, for example, let's look at Bobby Green's record, right? Bobby Green has been throughout his career a fighter who's had lots of ups and downs, and coming into 2023, going into that Tony Ferguson fight, he was riding a 2-fight loss streak that went into a no contest against Jared Gordon. His last win would have been against Nasrat Haqparast all the way in February of 2022. So over a year, getting close to 2 years since the last time Bobby's won. He beats Tony, then goes on and gets a main event slot against Grant Dawson. Terrible main event, by the way. I can't believe the quality of these Fight Night main events right now. But he gets that slot, and what does he do? His opponent lands 0 strikes, and in 7 strikes, he jab KOs Grant Dawson, gives him a loss in a fight where he had, in a lot of people's eyes, no business even standing a chance. He should have gotten taken down and mauled by the white Islam Makhachev, but that's not what happened. And so he had great momentum there, right? He completely turned around, and he showed you that you can turn around your momentum. But then you're like, okay, this is awesome. Bobby Green turned it around. He's got this great momentum now. What's he going to do next? He gets slated on one of the most stacked fight nights of the year. Goes from that terrible main event that he was in to a stacked fight night. Dariush Saryukin in Austin. He is slated to go against Dan Hooker. This huge ranked matchup. Bobby Green is in the rankings now. We're talking about Bobby Green maybe fighting Dustin Poirier again. If he gets a win here against Dan Hooker, what could happen in his career? But Dan Hooker's got to pull out. Instead, he takes on Jalen Turner. What was happening with Jalen Turner recently? Well, Jalen Turner had a terrible 2023 up until that point. He got robbed, in my opinion, against Mateusz Gamrot, but it was a split decision loss that he did not end up picking it. Two judges saw it for Mateusz Gamrot. And then he went against Dan Hooker, and he beat the crap out of Dan Hooker for a round and a half, and then Dan Hooker just zombied it out, took a head kick that literally shattered his skull and somehow still continued to fight, and then won the second half of the fight. So another split decision loss. That's got to be frustrating, right? Losing 2 in a row, no matter how you lose them sucks, but losing 2 in a row and they're both split decisions, you could arguably think that you won either of those fights. He thinks he won the Gamrot one. He doesn't think that he won the Turner one. But regardless, the Hooker one, rather, I misspoke. Regardless, that's got to be frustrating, right? So if you're looking at momentum, you would pick Bobby Green to beat Jalen Turner. But instead, he got absolutely starched by Turner in round 1, 2 minutes 49 seconds in, one of the worst stoppages of the year. Probably actually got knocked out at 2.5 minutes in, and then the ref just watched him get knocked out for another 20 seconds. It was pretty disgusting. But all of that being said, momentum can change a lot. You can change your momentum, but as well, if you're riding good momentum, that'll completely change how we talk about your matchup. So let's talk about the start to this card, and it's one of the fights that I'm most excited about. And honestly, one of the ones where talking about momentum becomes the most intriguing. Enter Peter Yan. If you were talking about this guy back in 2020, 2021, you're talking about this guy like a killer. He might be able to go on and match Dominic Cruz's records. He might go on to become a great of the sport. He is this crazy Russian killer. He's gonna, take a couple of rounds, download you, and then just start making his reads and just tear you apart, right? So he destroys Aldo, in round 5 of their fight back in 2020, and he is looking to defend that belt, and people think he's going to be able to get it done, and he is well on the way in his first defense. He is beating up Aljamain Sterling, one of the worst stylistic matchups for him in the division in retrospect, and he's making it look easy because Aljo kind of had a bad game plan going into that fight, kind of gassed himself out, and Peter Yan's actually the one putting the takedowns on him. Peter Yan's the one about to finish the fight until he throws that knee. And we get into some problematic territory after that point. And that is where you get to the point where at one point he was on this crazy streak. What is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 wins in a row in the UFC bantamweight division, with wins over Uriah Faber, Jimmy Rivera, John Dodson, and Jose Aldo. I mean, he's building a resume here. And then he throws that knee, right? And then you might think, okay, well, it doesn't look all lost, because afterwards he has that banger fight against Corey Sandhagen. He picks up the unanimous decision, and he picks up that interim belt, and then he's got his rematch against Aljo, right? So he can get it done. He can avenge that loss here. But super close fight, doesn't end up going his way. Again, a split decision like we were talking about with Turner. And split decisions, man, that's kind of the story of it for Peter Yan at this point, because then he would go on to fight this man right here, Sugar Sean O'Malley, at UFC 280 in Abu Dhabi, and he would not get his hand raised there, again by split decision, in a fight that a lot of people think he won. A lot of people think that he beat Aljo and he beat Sean O'Malley, but he didn't in the eyes of 2 of those judges, and that's what matters. It doesn't matter what any of us think. If every single person watching here scored that fight for Peter Yan at home, it doesn't change the fact that right now, in his last 5 fights, Peter Yan is 1-4. And that's crazy. Because you could argue he shouldn't have gotten DQ'd against Aljo. If you think Aljo that got that Oscar-winning performance out there, you can argue he beat Aljo the second time. And you can argue he beat Sean O'Malley. But none of those things are what happened. We're in the world where he got DQ'd, lost his belt, and then lost those 2 split decisions before running into the machine, Merab Dvalishvili, who put on a pace against him and left him looking like he saw a ghost after it. It was pretty bad. Now, we're in a really interesting spot going up against Song Yadong. If Song Yadong goes against Peter Yan back in 2020, 2021, I mean, his best fight at that point was against, like, Julio Arce, Casey Kennedy. He had a loss on his record to Kyler Phillips. I mean, I'm not sure that Song Yadong wouldn't win that fight, but would it be like pick-em odds? I don't think so. We're having a completely different conversation. And the reason that we're having a completely different conversation is because of momentum. Now, in his last 5, we are talking about a guy who is 4-1 as opposed to 1-4. And he picked up wins on the trek against Marlon Moraes, Julio Arce, as I mentioned before, Ricky Simon, and Chris Gutierrez in a main event slot. 2 main event slots back-to-back, by the way, which he won both of. One of those by round 5 knockout, and one of those by unanimous decision. So, we know that he can go the distance. He's proven that to himself. He's proven that he can handle grappling threats if Peter Yan wants to throw those at him. And he's proven that he can handle striking threats with Chris Gutierrez and with Marlon Moraes. The one loss along the trek, I don't even think people even hold against him that much either, in another main event slot against Corey Sandhagen, which he got finished in round 4 because of cuts. Incredible game plan by Corey Sandhagen, because he realized, I'm not going to knock this kid out. He's got too crazy thick of a skull. I'm just going to start cutting him up with these elbows whenever he crashes on me. That was a great stylistic read from Corey Sandhagen, but you know who doesn't make great stylistic reads like that? Peter Yan, who is going to hold that tight boxing guard up while Merab Dvalishvili shoots 84 takedowns and misses all of them on him. Now, am I saying that there is necessarily adjustments that he could make to his style over the course of one fight to not get abused by Merab like that? I don't know. I feel like he probably didn't respect the challenge that Merab was going to give him in that fight and needed to have done more adjustments beforehand. But whatever it ends up being, I don't know that he will be the one to make an adjustment like Corey Sandhagen did there necessarily. And obviously he throws elbows, he can cut people up, he went to war with Sean O'Malley. I'm not saying that he's going to lose to Song Yadong today for that reason, but I'm saying that if Song Yadong starts putting a pace on him, starts getting the better of the striking, starts making it difficult for Yan to really ever get comfortable and start making reads, start stuffing every takedown that Yan goes for if he ever decides to try and mix it up and go for the grappling. Or, you know, Song Yadong can wrestle too. He took down Chris Gutierrez twice. You know, he took down Corey Sandhagen twice. If Song Yadong starts mixing in the grappling, maybe he watched that horrible main event that Yan had against Merab, and he wants to shoot and miss 82 takedowns against him too. Then Yan could be in for a world of trouble, and it's really going to be the question of whether or not Yadong is ready in this stage of his career, or if Yan has done enough to stop his momentum on his rise. And that's why this is a banger fight. And that's kind of the whole story of this card, is somebody is on the come up. They are trying to prove themselves. They have this momentum behind them, pushing them up. And there's someone who's been here. They don't necessarily have that momentum backing them, but they're crafty, and they're going to have to try and settle in and defend that spot that they have against that rising momentum. So if I had to pick for this first fight, I'm going with Song Yadong. And you can't feel confident with any pick in MMA. The sport is too unpredictable. But it's about as confident a pick as I have on this card. I trust Song Yadong to dig deep and get there. And I think one part of it too, with that momentum, is hunger too. I mean, when you're talking about someone like, for example, Conor McGregor at this point in his career, the hunger that he showed in his fight against Chad Mendes compared to how he looked against Khabib. Now, I'm a huge Khabib fan. I understand Khabib is a way harder fight than Chad Mendes, but the Conor that fought Jose Aldo, if we got that kind of Conor in a camp against Khabib, I think that you would have seen a more competitive fight than we got, because you saw a liquor salesman who's addicted to cocaine and had all of the money in the world fighting Khabib who was getting even more money for that fight. Obviously, he was still motivated, and there was a ton of shit talk going in that fight. He was motivated for a plethora of reasons, don't get me wrong, but motivated in the way that the Conor that wanted to become a double champ was? No. Like, ever since that Floyd fight, the motivation that you saw to Conor McGregor, the kind of Conor McGregor you saw, was fundamentally different, right? And Peter Yan's already won UFC gold. Does he want to wear it again? I have no doubt in my mind he wants to wear it again. I have no doubt in my mind he wants to get that belt back. He wants to defend that belt. He wants to right the wrong of that dumb knee that his corner told him to throw for some reason. But Song Yadong's never touched a UFC title before. And there's never been a male Chinese champion before. And you can bet your ass he wants to be that. So my money's going on Song Yadong on that first fight. I don't think he's going to finish Peter Yan. He could, but I don't think he will. I think that it'll go to decision, and I'm betting on Song. So there we go. Let's move up the card and talk about this very great matchup between Jack Della Maddalena and Gilbert Burns. Now, Jack Della Maddalena, 16-2 on the trot overall, undefeated in the UFC at 7-0, facing off against the veteran Indorino, who in his last 5 fights totes a record of 3-2. Those 2 losses coming to Khamzat Chimaev in a Fight of the Year winner, if I'm not mistaken, back in 2022. And then a very underwhelming performance in the co-main event of UFC 288. Is worth noting and remembering. He took that fight on short notice, and he was very overtrained going into that fight. Took a lot of injuries in round 1. And the main reason he took so many injuries is because he fought to start out the year, January 21st, on UFC 283, Teixeira versus Hill. Absolutely little brothered Neil Magny in round 1. Then fought again in April for the co-main event of Pereira Adesanya 2, UFC 287 in Miami. And had a 3-round performance against Jorge Masvidal. Again, went the full distance there. So that's 2 camps in the first 4 months of the year. And then May 6th, only a month later, took that fight on short notice against a killer in Bilal. Obviously, he's not going to kill him because he's just going to 50-45 him. But still, I mean, you can't fight somebody who's the caliber of someone like Bilal Muhammad, or even like a Leon Edwards and Israel Adesanya on short notice like that when you're that overtrained, and expect a fantastic result. Those guys are incredibly difficult. You need a full camp for somebody like that, and he didn't have it. So, obviously, you got to keep that in mind. But on the trek, wins over Jorge Masvidal. He was super washed, but it's Jorge, so obviously he's super washed. Neil Magny, which he dominated him on the ground. So that was an incredible performance. And then kind of a really lackluster performance, honestly, over Stephen Thompson, but he did get it done. What's weird here is that, honestly, the best performance out of Gilbert's last 5, if we're being, like, fully honest with ourselves, if it's not that Neil Magny fight, it's probably that loss to Khamzat Chimaev, which is weird to say, but it definitely feels, because you're not giving it to a fight where he only threw 10 more strikes than Stephen Thompson over the course of 3 rounds. He basically just lay and prayed him the entire fight. It was not super great. And then he did dominate Jorge Masvidal, but he was never able to mount any, like, deep or serious, significant, like, submission threat. And the striking differential is only 3 towards Gilbert Burns. It was a clear, unanimous decision for him. Jorge did nothing that fight and got worked, like, the whole time. He retired Jorge in front of his hometown as well, but it wasn't like an inspiring performance. When you watch him versus Khamzat, you honestly get more excited about Gilbert Burns than you will watching any of those fights except for the Neil Magny fight. And that's, again, momentum, right? Gilbert Burns is somebody who's fought for a UFC title before. He hasn't gotten one, and he really wanted to. You can tell from that run that he was beginning to put together in 2023, taking down somebody as tough as Neil Magny is. He might be, like, super boring, and he's never gonna, like, be a UFC champion, but Neil Magny is a tough out. Finishing Neil Magny is tough for a lot of these elite guys to do. I mean, Shavkat was able to do it, But Ian Gary is super good too, and that guy wasn't able to finish Neil Magny at all, and he was beating the crap out of Neil Magny. Neil Magny basically had one leg by the end of that Ian Gary fight, and he still hung in there and finish that fight out. So he's a tough out. To submit someone like Neil Magny in one-on-one, especially when there's so many doubts and question marks around your jiu-jitsu, since you're supposed to be such a talented practitioner of it, but haven't really implemented it that much in your MMA career as of late. Pretty great performance from him. But, like I said, momentum. This performance will be really interesting to see because while Jack Della Maddalena does arguably have the better momentum, he's still riding probably the weakest momentum he's had as of entering the UFC, and the main reason for that is just because he's had so much hype in the UFC, and right now he's actually coming off of 2 split decisions. Now, one of these absolutely should not be a split decision, like, at all. We'll talk about it, but let's just talk about kind of what his career's been so far. You don't know a lot about Jack Della Maddalena. He's this Australian boxer. He's got super nice hands, and he starts off his UFC run with a knockout in round 1, follows it up with another knockout in round 1. That one's the one over Ramzan Emeev. That one's free on YouTube right now, so if you haven't seen it, I recommend checking it out on the UFC's YouTube channel. Then another knockout in round 1, all of these so far with punches. And then you're now up to 2023, so we're getting into kind of his more notable fights. He fought Randy Brown on the UFC 284 card in Australia, and he knocked Randy down in about like round 1, a minute 40 in, and then secured the rear naked choke on the ground on a dazed opponent. But then, this is where you get to the controversial part, which has kind of halted his hype to some extent. I think there's still a lot of people super hyped on him, a lot of people picking him to win this fight. I'm picking him to win this fight, but this has certainly changed how you discuss Jack Della Maddalena in the context of momentum. And it's this fight night bout that he had on the Holm versus Bueno Silva main card, where he got taken to a split decision by Basel Hafez. And I'm going to be honest with you guys, I know nothing about this guy. He hasn't fought since. This is his only fight in the UFC, so it was his debut, and he was taking Jack Della down. He was getting some productive control time in there. I don't remember this fight that much because it was like super boring, and I haven't rewatched it, to be honest with you, because I don't think that it's gonna like factor in here a ton. But if Gilbert's shooting in there for takedowns and he's not looking to scrap with Jack Della, which definitely could be his game plan, you might look at this, because one thing I do remember from this fight is that Jack Della was sitting on some guillotines, I think, and you never really want to see a striker who wants to keep it on the feet have their like primary line of defense for a takedown be sitting on a guillotine. Like Dustin Poirier will do it all the time, where he'll be fighting someone and then they'll shoot in on a takedown, and instead of doing the fundamentals, instead of like getting an underhook in there, trying to do anything to keep himself up on the feet, he just kind of accepts that he's going to get taken down and then goes for a guillotine that never works on anybody who's good, but is always there as like an option to threaten and make DC and Joe Rogan scream that you've got a submission in until the guy just pops his head out every single time. So if that happens a bunch, then you might want to start looking at your live betting, get Gilbert Burns in there, because he might actually capitalize on ground control time in a way that Basel Hafez wasn't able to do to get 2 of those judges' scorecards. I think this being a split decision is fine. I scored it for JDM live, if I recall correctly, but I don't hate it being a split decision. He outstruck him pretty bad, 83-32. But I don't recall there being like a ginormous like differential of damage or anything like that, where like one guy was just like fucked up and the other guy was fine. Jack Della Maddalena then faced off in the co-main event of UFC Fight Night Grasso versus Shevchenko 2, UFC Noche, against Kevin Holland. And there's some people to this day who say that this is a robbery and Kevin Holland should have won. And I just think that that's really good evidence that there's a lot of people who still smoke crack in the MMA community, because I have no idea how you watch this fight and score it for Kevin Holland. That's just me. You should go back and watch it and let me know in the comments if you think that you can score it for Holland. I don't really think you can. One of the judges think you can, I guess. But I think Jack Della Maddalena pretty clearly won all three of these rounds. There might have been one round I scored for Holland, maybe. I think I did. Maybe like round 2. But then that's 29-28 Jack Della. So it's still like, I don't think that that's a robbery. And as well, I mean, let's stop using the term robbery like most of the time. There's been robberies, for sure. Like a fight where you watch it and the right guy lost. Like, it's just, you can't score it for the other guy. It doesn't make any sense. And it somehow, I mean, like, if, look at the Corey Sandhagen versus Cheeto Vera fight from last year. Go watch that fight again. And then tell me if 2 judges had that scorecard that was like 3-4-5 Cheeto. Tell me that is a robbery. That makes sense, right? But if you try and tell me that Kevin Holland losing like basically a sparring match against Jack Della Maddalena with how unseriously he was taking some of those rounds as a robbery, like, get over yourself, man. We need to use these terms correctly and properly, because if we just call every decision that we disagree with a robbery, we're just never going to have intelligent or proper discourse about anything, like, ever. So, Strickland DDP was not a robbery. DDP won that, is what I'm talking about, just so you know. Okay. This fight, I don't know if there's a ton that I really think is that interesting to talk about here other than that in terms of momentum and how that could interact. Dorino could definitely bounce back into it big here. Interesting to see how the title picture will shake up if he gets back into it, because you got to think he's only maybe 1-2 wins out from a shot at the title with a good win over Jack Della Maddalena. I see this one going to decision as well, but if anybody gets a finish here, I don't think I see Burns submitting Jack Della, but it could happen theoretically. Or I think Jack Della could remind us all that Burns is a little bit chinny, just like Usman did, and put him down on his butt. So we will see. That one should definitely be fun. And I think a lot of people are sleeping on it as something that could be really fun. One fight I'm kind of sleeping on, and a lot of people are looking forward to a lot. And it's not that I'm not looking forward to it. I just don't really have that much to say about it, is Kevin Holland versus MVP. I think that this is just going to be essentially whether or not Kevin Holland can get over himself and become a mixed martial artist instead of whatever he is right now. Because he's like super talented and definitely could be elite if he wanted to. He just kind of doesn't for some reason. Like, he gets offended when you bring up the belt and try and ask him about that. And then he also will, like, self-sabotage himself in fights in ways that, like, makes no sense whatsoever. So, like, you're gonna lose the fight against Wonder Boy, and then because of that, capitalize on him being on the ground. So, that to me communicates you wanted to win against Wonder Boy, because once you realize you're gonna lose against him on the feet, you're gonna capitalize and go to the ground with him. So you, one, thought you could beat Wonder Boy on the feet, which is pretty inaccurate. Like, Shavkat didn't think that he could beat Wonder Boy on the feet, especially not with the injury that he had. But you gotta imagine Shavkat Rakhmanov's working in his grappling when he fights Wonder Boy, even if he doesn't have an injury, like he did against Jeff Neal. Like, Shavkat isn't disillusioned about how good his stand-up is. He knows that he has holes in his stand-up, his head movement isn't so good, and he was trying to grapple with Jeff Neal. You know, then that's smart. That's what you want to do if you have that in your bag, which Kevin Holland does. He just submitted Michael Chiesa and it was filth. And I know Chiesa was rocked first, but still, I mean, he has grappling in his bag, and he's a better grappler than most of the guys that he goes against, and then he just doesn't grapple them. So it's just really confusing. I don't know, like, what stage in his career he's at or what he wants to do. If he just wants to be, like, the modern Cowboy Cerrone and, like, fight anybody and just lose half of them, then that's, like, super cool. That's awesome if he wants to do that. I just think it's kind of frustrating because I think that he has a lot of potential and could do a lot with it. And I think that there might even be some part of him that knows that, and that's why he handles everything the way that he does. Think about, like, John Jones talking about how, like, he would party and like go out before his pay-per-view fights and stuff like that, so that if he was to ever lose one, he didn't have to accept that that was because he wasn't good enough. It was just because he went out and partied and he fucked up, pretty much. I almost feel like there could be some degree of that. So, like, super excited to see MVP debut in the UFC. Super excited to see how this fight goes. I think that it could end up being more boring than people think, because oftentimes when MVP faces people who are like as good as him, they just are really inactive in the fight. And I think Kevin Holland, especially coming off of that, in some people's eyes, lackluster performance against JDM, I think that you could get something a lot more boring than people anticipate. I don't think we see a finish here, but I could be wrong. And if we see a finish, I don't think it's Holland being smart and grappling with MVP. It's probably MVP putting him on his highlight reel. So if I was to bet anything here, if you could get a sexy line on MVP by KO, then you might go for that. But that's all I could really think to do. And I don't really want to talk about this fight that much more. It should be fun. I just don't really have like anything inspiring to talk about. But the best fight on the card, really, for talking about momentum is up here in the co-main event with Dustin the Diamond Poirier taking on the surging Benoit Saint Denis, the God of War, coming out of France. And this fight is going to be interesting, man. Benoit Saint Denis lost his UFC debut in truly a brutal beatdown that it's crazy wasn't stopped by the referee in round one. It was 149 to 67 in terms of strikes against Benoit, but ever since then, he's been on a great trek. He is 5-0 since that loss, with his last win coming in Madison Square Garden on the main card of UFC 295 against Matt Frevola by disgusting head kick KO, as Matt Frevola learned that you do need to keep your guard up as you run away from the clinch, because you can get kicked there and it doesn't feel super good. But he is not ranked nearly as high as Dustin Poirier, and he hasn't fought nearly the caliber of opponents that Dustin Poirier has. I'm going to pull up the UFC rankings because I don't remember what ranking spot we have BSD at right now. BSD is ranked 12, Poirier is ranked 3. Got to be one of the higher ranking disparities of any fight we've seen in a while. Probably the last one this big would be something like Suga versus Peter Yan, something like that, I would imagine. But the reason that you're seeing BSD bounce up this much is because in those last 5 fights, he's not only on a 5-fight win streak, he's on a 5-fight finishing streak. He got a second-round rear naked choke, a second-round knockout with punches, a first-round rear naked choke, a second-round knockout with punches over Thiago Moises, Dustin Poirier's teammate. By the way, crazy stat here, he had 5 takedowns and 101 strikes across those pretty much 2 complete rounds, which is pretty impressive output as well. Obviously, it was in a winning effort, and you got to think that a lot of those punches are thrown in flurry to end the fight. But still, I mean, really, really crazy output to have over the course of a 2-round fight. And that could look to factor in as he goes a full 5 rounds, which he's never been scheduled for in the UFC. I don't know what his outside of the UFC record looks like with regards to that, though. Obviously, you know Dustin Poirier has 5-round experience. He's coming off of a second-round head kick loss in the marquee fight of UFC 291, Poirier versus Gaethje 2. But that'll that'll happen. You'll get head kicked by Justin Gaethje every once in a while. And you can't get hung up over something like that. One thing to note that's really interesting when talking about this is that while momentum might look to factor in the form of BSD being on such a run and believing in himself so much, whereas Dustin Poirier is coming off a loss, and Dustin Poirier 3-2 in his last 5 with losses coming, like I said, to Justin Gaethje, and then also by sub rear naked choke to Charles Oliveira in round 3. But one thing, like I said, momentum's not a hard rule. Dustin Poirier loves to buck momentum. He has never lost 2 fights back-to-back in his UFC career. He lost his debut to Danny Castillo, put 5 together before losing to Chan Sung Jung. Then he got a win over Jonathan Brooks. Then he lost to Cub Swanson. Then he put 3 in a row together. Then he ran into Conor McGregor. Then he put 4 more in a row together. Then he lost to Michael Johnson. Then he beat Jim Miller. Then he has that no contest against Eddie Alvarez. 4 more together. Loses to Khabib. Then 3 wins in a row. Loses to Charles. Beats Michael Chandler. Loses to Gaethje. If he loses to BSD, this is the first time in his MMA career that Dustin Poirier has ever lost 2 fights in a row. And that's crazy. That's crazy to think about. Really, what you gotta ask here, and in this video, I haven't really been going too much into, like, style matchup stuff on, like, the nitty-gritties, really, of it. Obviously, I talked about some takedown defense stuff in the Burns versus Jack Della matchup, but, one of the weaker elements of BSD's game is his boxing defense, and Poirier is going to be getting into the pocket, and he's going to be lighting him up with those combinations, especially as this fight goes long, and Poirier will begin to test that gas tank of BSD, because I didn't mention, but this is a 5-round co-main event, so that does look to factor in here as well, as Poirier's 5-round experience is going to be a vital asset for him should this go the distance. One thing, too, we're going to talk about intangibles. Poirier coming off that head kick KO loss, going against a guy who just got a head kick KO. That's something to think about. This fight's going to be fun. This fight's going to be interesting. I think that both of these guys pose some stylistic threats to each other. I think that the grappling of BSD is going to be interesting to see how that factors. Historically, Poirier hasn't done incredible against people who are looking to take him down. I mean, he's lost to both Charles and Khabib most recently among those losses, but is BSD's wrestling the caliber of a Khabib Nurmagomedov? I don't think so. Obviously, probably not there. One thing to note, too, is that while he doesn't do well against those grapplers, and he did end up getting subbed by Charles shot 6 takedowns against Dustin and succeeded on none of them. So that's one thing. Really, the only grappler in recent memory who has just grabbed Dustin and ragdolled him is Khabib, who is just so strong that Dustin recently, or I think it was Dana talking about something Dustin had said to him, said that it was scary how much Khabib manhandled him. Is Benoit Saint Denis, who just got taken down by Matt Frivola and wasn't able to really mount any sort of takedown threat against Matt Frivola, is he gonna just ragdoll Poirier? I don't know. I don't think so, but it's certainly possible, especially considering that he does have, I think, the grappling advantage here. Obviously, Poirier's got that black belt, so that'll look to factor in, but he did manage to score this really nice reversal on Frivola as well during that fight. So he's got the grappling chops. It's not like he doesn't. This fight should be fun. I'm looking for Poirier to win this. I think that it might just be too early for Benoit. He might be looking to put on a pace and have a really exciting fight with Poirier. And if Poirier's just not out of there early, I don't see him losing down the stretch. I would probably look to see Poirier get a finish in the later rounds, maybe 3 or 4. But Benoit's game, so this fight could go the distance and it could be a banger the whole time. But momentum doesn't stop being talked about now, because in this main event, the discussion of momentum is really interesting, because it's not super often that you get to see a rematch where the guy who lost is doing better now than the guy who won the first time. And it's undisputably the case here, because Sean O'Malley, ever since losing to Marlon Vera, had one of his best performances against Thomas Almeida, had a killer performance against Chris Moutinho, then had another knockout against Raleigh Paiva, and obviously these are a bunch of cans, right? But he gets that no contest against Pedro Munoz, and when it comes time for Suga to elevate to the level where he gets this big step up in competition against Peter Yan, whether you think he won the fight or not, he did enough that 2 of those judges scored it for him. And that's what matters, really. At the end of the day, that's what matters. Because he got that opportunity off of winning that fight. And that opportunity could have been Peter Yan's instead if Peter Yan would have done a little bit more. That's always that edge, right? Because right now, Sugar Sean could be the one who's fighting Song Yadong on UFC 299's opening fight, and it could be Peter Yan facing against Marlon Vera in some weird alternate universe. But that's not the one that we're in, right? Because Sugar Sean got that opportunity. And talk about capitalizing on the opportunity when you get it. The best performance in his career to date against the hardest opponent in his career to date. One of the worst stylistic matchups for him in the division in Aljamain Sterling. He manages to not get put on the ground once, even after slipping and allowing Aljo a free entry to the clinch at the start of round 2. He manages to essentially force Aljo to make a mistake by pushing him out with that teep to the body, making Aljo want to reclaim that space with that lunging right hand, or was it a left hand? I don't know. Whichever strike that he overextended on very badly and got cracked by to lose his belt. Sean O'Malley is your bantamweight champion, and he's your bantamweight champion coming off of a 6-fight unbeaten streak here, the last loss coming to Marlon Vera. And that's only if you don't believe that the Sugar State Athletic Commission has overturned that loss, which many people believe that it has. And furthermore, with Marlon Vera, it's not that he doesn't have a win that he's coming off of, but if this fight would have happened, say, at the start of 2023, Sugar had already had the belt somehow, and then Marlon Vera was taking that fight before ever having fought Corey Sandhagen, we're talking about a completely different fight. Marlon Vera is one of the most hyped up people in the UFC at that point in time, coming off of a fight of the night against Davey Grant, a performance of the night, being the first person to ever KO Frankie Edgar, then another fight of the night where he beat the shit out of Rob Font, then a performance of the night with that disgusting head kick finish of Dominic Cruz. But after that, he goes and lays a ginormous egg against Corey Sandhagen. He got 50-45, really. I mean, you can try and give him a round if you're looking for it, and I don't think that there aren't rounds where it's maybe scoreable for Cheeto if you're looking to do it, but you have to be trying to score the fight for him to get anything for him, and even then you can't score the fight for him to have won it. There's just no way that you could do that and be honest with yourself at the end of the day. And then even his last fight, with that unanimous decision win over Pedro Munoz that earned himself this opportunity, if you would have asked me after that fight, is Marlon Vera the number 1 contender at bantamweight? I would have told you no. Because Corey Sandhagen clearly has a better case, having already had a head-to-head win in current year over Marlon. But Murata has a way better case too. And even Aljo has a better case to get a rematch for his belt than Cheeto does. The only reason Cheeto gets a shot at this is because he beat Sugar. And that does make for a compelling fight, but it also makes for a really weird scenario where I don't feel that the momentum is favoring Cheeto here, even though he's the guy who won last time. And does part of that rest on how exactly he won that fight? That's a hard question to answer, because it kind of depends on how those guys define it for themselves. When you hear Marlon Vera talk about it, it sounds to me like he feels like he beat Sugar Sean, but it feels kind of tongue-in-cheek to me a little bit when he talks about it. He's like, he was knocked out when I won, so I won. And it's like, maybe that injury to his leg was a little fluky, but I still won, that's kind of the vibe I get from it. And I don't know, he might not view it that way, and it matters more what he thinks about it than it does what I think about it. Because it's all about his mindset and his perspective. If he feels like he has a win over Sugar, then that helps him going into this. He's fighting somebody he already kicked the ass of one time, right? And some people have critiqued how Sean looked at the first one, and to some extent, I think there is room to critique it, because you need to understand that Cheeto is dangerous. He is someone who did finish you last time, and even if the way that he got you to the ground to end up landing those strikes that knocked you out was fluky and weird with him hitting that nerve on your leg, he still was able to, once he got you in that position, land damage that hurt you enough to do that. That means he's a threat to knock you out. That's what it means. Plain and simple. And that's going to be a really interesting dynamic to see. The other dynamics about this fight that I find really intriguing is that it feels like Sean has to win by decision almost. And I think that that's a dynamic he has to battle because all of us feel that way. It's so popular of a talking point that essentially he's in there for 25 minutes against somebody he can't submit and can't knock out. That's what it feels like because nobody's been able to do it. But if anybody could do it, it would be somebody like Sugar Sean. I mean, he has the power to knock out any bantamweight in that division, I really feel like, unless Cheeto is the one who can't be knocked out. I mean, there's got to be some threshold of force that could get him out of there, but whether you can actually land that shot or not, and any bantamweight can generate that force, that is yet to be determined. We haven't seen anybody do it. That'll be interesting to see if he can get it done, because right now, I think if you ask most analysts, if this fight ends in a finish, they're picking Cheeto, I think, in that instance, because Cheeto, you would think, has a better opportunity to get a submission, and you would think has the better odds of getting some sort of knockout or TKO. I think grappling is interesting in this fight. I don't think that people are going to be talking about grappling a lot going into this fight, but I think that we should be talking about grappling going into this fight, because Suga is an underrated grappler. People don't understand the kind of grappler that he is and what kind of chops he has as a grappler, because he doesn't have to grapple, and he hasn't really had to grapple, and obviously he would prefer not to grapple, because striking is what his style is, and it's what he's best at doing. But I think that his grappling chops are good, and I think that he could utilize offensive grappling to minimize a lot of the threats that Cheeto poses in a way not dissimilar to how Corey Sandhagen managed to do that throughout his fight, mixing in that grappling with Cheeto. But Cheeto could also get submissions off of his back. He's an active threat off of his back. It's just that I think Suga is ready to handle a challenge of that caliber too. This fight's going to be interesting. I think that this fight's going to be a lot more interesting than we think that it'll be. I think that Sugar Sean O'Malley will get his hand raised. But I think that it's not going to be an easy fight by any means. I do see it going the distance, but I think that Suga has the opportunity to become a star by knocking out Marlon Vera, being the first person to do it. That's promotional gold mine right there for the UFC to be able to say, look at this guy. He knocked out Cheeto Vera, who's never been finished. The guy with the most finishes in bantamweight just got finished, and he never had before. And it was by this guy with this funny pink hair. Because the thing is, and this is kind of what I'll close off on here, on the topic of momentum, and tying it into another thing here, is that the draw power of Sugar Sean O'Malley has largely been drawn into question. It's why a lot of people feel that this card is as stacked as it is. But what I feel a lot of people don't understand is that the star power of somebody is not solely defined by any single metric. We look to pay-per-view buys to define how big of a draw or a star someone is, and it's not that they aren't important. They really are. But there's so many different ways in which these fans are reached by these fighters. So you have some people who are so huge that, like, Conor McGregor, everybody knows what Conor's doing. When he releases a video saying he's fighting, I have family members who are talking about it who never watch MMA, and they know that Conor's going to be fighting. I have coworkers who know that I know about MMA and ask me, like, oh, when's Conor going to be fighting? Didn't he say that it was going to be in July or something? Like, they've seen the video and stuff like that, right? So you've got that level, and then you have some who are super popular in terms of, like, how they reach out to, like, the hardcore fans, right? Like, Volkanovski isn't a household name. Not everybody knows who Volkanovski is. But if you ask a hardcore who he is, everybody loves Volkanovski, right? And there's different levels of reach that people can have, but Suga has a reach to the casuals that is parallel to somebody like Connor. And I'm not saying that he's on that level, but when you're comparing his draw to someone like Izzy, that's another good comparison. There's like a good amount of casuals who know Izzy, but I feel like the amount of casuals who know about Suga is more. And the reason for that is because he might not sell as many pay-per-views as someone like Izzy does, because more hardcore is like Izzy than someone like Suga. But a lot of casuals do know Suga because he's so successful on social media with his podcast, with his Instagram, with things like this, which reach out to a younger audience who isn't really buying pay-per-views, whether they're too young to even care about like watching the fights live, like they just watch the highlights afterwards, or whether they're more in like an age demographic like mine, where a lot of people are going to watch the fights online, or they'll go to a bar and watch the fights. Then you might not translate that to pay-per-view sales, but how he does translate that to pay-per-view sales is by being a massive star like he is right now, getting the belt like he did, and then having triumphant finishes that make people excited to see his next fight. That's when you'll cultivate an audience and have people who will grow up into the sport more and actually maybe buy a pay-per-view and get those sales up. But until he gets that, then I think that he still will have questionable draw ability. But it's going to be an interesting card. I think this card is stacked from top to bottom. I think that the main card might go a lot of decisions if my predictions are correct for it. But even if it does, they should be really technical and really fun fights. So I hope you guys have a great time this weekend watching UFC 299. Let me know what your favorite fight is down below. If I said anything that you agree with or disagree with a lot, let me know in the comments, and have a wonderful rest of your day.